Allegations that the Russian government used Facebook to try to influence the U.S. election are troubling for many reasons. For journalist Franklin Foer, they are also a ready example of how technology titans, such as Facebook, Amazon, and Google, influence the lives of people around the world for the worse. He makes that case in his new book. It's called World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech, and he joins us now for more. Frank, it's good to meet you. Nice to have you here at TVO.
Good to be here.
Okay, the title of the book, World Without Mind, where did that come from?
It came from the fact that we're living in this world where we have these big companies and we're increasingly ceding over various aspects of our life to them. And so they want to automate the world for us, not just automate the way that we do mechanical work or automate transportation. They're trying to automate mental functions. And we're in the process of merging with machines, that we wear this technology on our wrists now. We wear it on the bridge of our glass if it's Google Glass. And if you listen to the founders of Google, they want to implant Google straight into our brain. And the problem is that these tools can be amazing, but we're not just merging with the tools, we're merging with the companies that run the machines.
Okay, that's the title. Now let's do the subtitle. The existential threat of big tech. You really think this is an existential threat to the world?
An existential threat in that it's to humanity, in that we're changing the definition of what it means to be human. We're losing various qualities that I would say are central to being human as we merge with these machines. So things such as privacy, such as our ability to hold our attention and to contemplate the world. I feel like these things are under threat. And then the political questions, which you referenced in the beginning of the show, the fact that we now rely on these companies in lots of ways to interface with reality, that they stand between us and news, that they're shaping what we consider to be important in the world without us really actually paying a whole lot of attention to that. And soon we're going to be occupying the virtual realities that these companies create and maintain.
You actually started writing this book a few years ago, and then Donald Trump got elected. Right. How did this book change when that event took place?
Well, it's interesting because I think the zeitgeist is in the process of shifting considerably. So when I started writing this book, I felt like people looked at me funny because these companies were held in such high regard by the public, and it was hard to see that there was anything necessarily wrong with them. But as we've turned through this calendar year with the election of Donald Trump and this outsized role that Facebook played in the election, and the way that Facebook has created a system that has really weakened our intellectual guard, that so many citizens rely on Facebook to get news, and it's made them susceptible they rely on Facebook for news. It's made them susceptible to fake news, propaganda. They're bad actors out in the world who are trying to influence the system, as the Russians did and as lots of other bad actors try to do. And so I think that it was a wake-up call. I mean, just to see how profoundly we depended on these platforms, and that these platforms weren't always as virtuous as we thought or they claimed.
We mentioned three of them in the intro: Facebook, Amazon, Google. We didn't mention Apple, and neither do you. How come?
I mentioned Apple a little bit, and I actually, as I've come to talk about the book, I regret in some ways not mentioning Apple more, because Apple creates the phone, which is really at the core of our addiction. I mean, I shudder to think how many times I check my phone over the course of a day.
Now, which ones? The ones you keep on you, or the previous four that you've never got stashed in a basement in your box somewhere?
Exactly. Those are stashed away. I'm not checking those. And I'm checking the one that I own enough for all four.
What are you keeping those ones for anyway?
Well, the point is that these companies run us through their products, and that there's a concept in engineering called designed obsolescence, so that these devices are created to ultimately be disposable. That if Apple wanted to, they could probably create the device in such a way that it had a much longer lifespan, but then you wouldn't be upgrading every couple months.
Yeah, you know, though, they said the same thing about General Motors in my dad's day, which was they built a car designed to fall apart after 3 years, so you'd have to go buy a new one.
Right, well, which is true. I mean, it's part of the nature of capitalism. And in some ways, you can't ding these companies for doing what companies do. But we also have to acknowledge the ways in which these companies are different. So one way in which the companies are different is that they've amassed all this data. And what is data? Well, they followed you everywhere. They know what you read, They know everything that you've entered into Google. They know what you've liked. They know what you've bought. They've known physically where you actually travel, and they tie it all together, and it becomes a picture of the inside of your brain, which they then leverage in order to addict you to their products.
You have a very funny line in the book, I'm going to see if I can remember it, where you say, all Google wanted to do was understand and know the sum total of every piece of knowledge in human history ever, and actually their aim is bigger than that.
Right.
They want to go beyond that, don't they? What else do they want to do?
Right. So Google, of course, they're inventing driverless cars now, which I happen to think is a great thing. They're trying to achieve immortality for human beings because they have a life sciences company. And you know what? I don't know if I want to live forever, but if they can extend my life a little bit, that's okay. But the point is that these companies are everything companies. Amazon started off advertising itself as the everything store. And that too became too narrow for Amazon, which now powers the cloud, owns the Washington Post, owns a movie studio, owns Whole Foods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these companies want to just to immerse themselves in your life. Right now, there's an arms race to become your personal assistant. That they all want to be what Zuckerberg called it, your butler, but it's Amazon's Alexis, which are these, or Google Home product. They want to create artificial intelligences that wake us in the morning and then guide us through the day as they present choices to us and help us work through the world.
Here's Franklin Foer in World Without Mind. At their most idealistic moments, the tech giants drape their pursuit of monopoly in grandiose rhetoric about human rights and connection, a lofty sense of self-mission that makes the growth of these networks an imperative. Their size becomes an end unto itself. They aspire to escape competition, to exist on their own plane, so they can fulfill their transcendent potential. The word monopoly was always a dirty word, you know, when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Is it still?
Not really. I think maybe we're turning a corner back to treating it in that sort of way. But over the course of the generations, really starting in the 1960s, but culminating in kind of the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher view of the world, we just stopped caring about size. And our definition and our understanding of monopoly shifted. And there was Robert Bork, who was a famous American jurist who was nominated for the Supreme Court in an aborted nomination, wrote a famous article saying, look, the only reason we should care about monopoly is if it affects consumer welfare. And so the only reason you should care about a monopoly is if it raised prices. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why one would theoretically want to care about a monopoly beyond simply what something costs. And so, but we adopted Bork's definition, and it kind of was universally adopted. And so the number of enforcement cases brought against big companies, against monopolistic companies, diminished over time.
You know, one area where you could imagine a monopoly is a bad thing is, for example, the newspaper business, where you'd want to have a multiplicity of voices. We do, thankfully, in the capital city here. We've got 4 daily newspapers. But I wonder how culpable you believe journalism is in the dominance of these companies that you write about.
I think they've been highly culpable, and there's this interdependence where journalism comes to rely on Google and Facebook in order to get revenue. So what journalism needs now is web traffic, and the way you get web traffic is by producing things that are successful on these mass platforms. Now, did journalism have a choice in the matter? Did they have to accede to these platforms? Did they have to become so dependent on them? I don't think that they did, but journalism was going through a fairly perilous period in its history, and it felt very insecure about how it would confront this new digital era. And so it made choices which, in retrospect, I think proved wrong.
From journalism to food. Here we go, another excerpt from the book. Here's where the food movement provides an object lesson. The culture industries need to present themselves as the organic alternative, a symbol of social status and aspiration. Media must denounce their most recent phase to lead a rebellion against the processed, ephemeral, speed-based writing encouraged by the tech companies. How'd you get from food to culture?
So it struck me that with food, 50 years ago, we had the advent of TV dinners and processed food, and it seemed so great at the time. You know, no more pots and pans, there's no more daily trips to the store. And then we woke up 50 years later and we said, holy cow, these foods were engineered to make us fat. And in the course of embracing them, we completely transformed the economics of food. We led to the concentration of power in the handful of a small number of corporations. And I don't want the same thing to happen to the stuff that we ingest through our minds. And so I just noticed the ways in which things had been reverse engineered to please, in the same sort of way that food was reverse engineered to please. That there's an equivalent to the way in which salt and sugar are stuffed into everything that we eat, all the processed foods we eat. I think the same thing happens with a lot of the way in which journalism is created, especially when it's meant to flourish on Facebook.
Okay, let's see if I can torture this metaphor a little more here, which is
to
say, I think we're getting the idea that too much sugar and too much salt in our daily diets is a bad thing for us. And, you know, many people to a greater or lesser extent are trying to change that. I'm not sure you can go back when it comes to journalism. You know, the days of you and me being the sort of editorial gatekeepers of what everybody gets to know in this society, we're not going back to that world. So what's the alternative?
Well, actually, I think food, let's torture the metaphor a few more times. So in food, we see that there is a backlash and that there is the rise of, there has been the rise over the course of many years in organic food. And the sense that, all right, we're going to buy our food because it's more virtuous. It may not be more efficient. It may cost more money to buy that food, but we're going to make a choice in our lives, a choice that reflects our aspirations for ourselves and for our world. That food may actually not be all that much more nutritious at the end of the day, but it's a statement. And so I wonder, I actually think it is possible to create the equivalent sense of aspiration and virtue when it comes to journalism and knowledge and culture.
You seeing any evidence of that right now?
I am,
like
in fact. So I look at the way in which the New York Times has marketed itself after Donald Trump's election, that the paper has aggressively marketed itself as the antidote to fake news.
And subscriptions are up?
Yeah, and subscriptions are up.
Washington Post doing the same thing?
It is, yeah.
They having any luck with it?
Yeah, they are.
Ironically owned by Jeff Bezos, the guy who owns Amazon?
Yeah.
Huh. Okay, but are you arguing for a more, you know, this is a very dirty word in Donald Trump's America now, are you arguing for a more elitist media?
I am. In fact, I am. Because I think that the way that our world works, especially when it comes to media and culture, is that you're defined by what you do at the high end and you're defined what you do at the low end, and each has implications for the other. And if we can, we have greater ability to affect at this stage the things that happen at the high end. And so if we can preserve a sense of high standards for elitist media, for the upper echelon of media, I think it can elevate the rest of the culture because it becomes something that the rest of the culture then will start to aspire towards.
I may be nitpicking here, but I see a difference between elite media and elitist media. Do you know what I'm saying?
Maybe, but I think that you're saying that the New York Times...
Yeah, the former being okay, something to strive for, the latter being the reason you got Donald Trump.
I disagree. I mean, I think that if you look at culture, so the way that say the New York Times or maybe your finest newspapers approach culture is actually in a fairly elitist sort of way. That we're going to cover classical music or dance or modern art, even though the masses don't necessarily care about those things because we deem them to be important. We're not bowing to the demands of the market. Maybe the market doesn't want to hear about the plight of the Rohingya in Burma, but damn it, we think that it's important for the market to hear these things. And so that's what I mean by elitist, that you need to have the people who are gatekeepers. And look, every democracy has gatekeepers. You can pretend that they don't exist, as Mark Zuckerberg pretends.
Well, he's the biggest one now, isn't he?
He's the biggest one. Yeah. And so I think it's important for the people who are gatekeepers to actually have some sort of sense of morality, to care about what people are consuming, what information passes through their gates.
Let's go into the home stretch here by checking out how you have or have not changed your habits since writing this book. Now that you, I mean, presumably you're still online, you're still obsessed with the internet, you're still using it to get information. How have your habits changed or not?
So it's interesting. This book has actually put me in contact with a lot of people who've given me a lot of ideas about how I can transform my life, and I've accepted them because they're interesting, and it wouldn't have occurred to me in other ways. I met a guy who was a former employee of Google called Tristan Harris, and he had had a job as ethicist in chief of Google, and he ended up leaving. And he says, you know what? It's worse than you think in terms of the ways in which these technologies are engineered to addict. And he has an organization called Time Well Spent that has some really interesting suggestions. They're not big suggestions, but they give you a sense of agency, that you're actually actively making choices in how you let technology into your life. So, for instance, can I give you a for instance?
Sure.
For instance, I've been known to sleep with my phone. And you know what? As I talk about this, a lot of people sleep with their phones.
Yep.
And it's actually very disruptive to your circadian rhythms.
It's terrible.
And I know people, I think it's pretty common when you wake up in the middle of the night that you end up hearing a notification, and you end up getting sucked into this endless scroll.
That's
that
why
is
you
Facebook.
should put it in another room.
You put your phone in another room.
Of course you do.
Of course you do. But you know what? People don't.
Well, let's do another example. And this, again, I plucked this one out of the book because you used to read books, and then you bought a Kindle, right? And then it was nothing but Kindle for you for a while, and then you found that you were kind of accidentally going back to the hard copy.
Yeah, I've had myself subconsciously gravitating back to paper books. And you know what? I'm not alone. That when the Kindle was debuted, there were all sorts of predictions about the demise of the paper book. People actually put a date on it, and they said by the year 2015, paper books are going to become extinct. And for many reasons, we as a society have decided we don't want that to happen. In part, credit goes to the book publishers who decided that they didn't want their information to be free, and they defended the core economic value of their product. But I think also we as individuals just have this intuitive sense that we're distracted all day long. We're notified, we're pinged, we're dinged. We live on screens, but in order to be thinking human beings, we need time where we detach from the screens and we exist in this world where you're inhabiting the seams of the system. Nobody's monitoring you when you watch this. Nobody's looking over your shoulder. You're not being tracked. You're not being umbilically connected to an Amazon store. You're able to exist within this very separate universe. And books are the place where we actually have the most privacy. That's why we read in bed or in the bathtub or in our favorite easy chair, where nobody's watching us and we get to be mentally most alive.
But if I remember correctly, that's not a decision you actually made. You sort of fell into that.
Yeah.
You kind of naturally missed holding something in your hand and turning pages.
Yes.
Do you see that happening across society?
Well, I do. I mean, just in that I can look at the sales numbers and I can see that ebook sales have plateaued or maybe dipped a little bit, and that paper book sales increased just a little bit every year. It's not a boom business, but given how many people predicted that they were going to go the way of the dodo, it's kind of incredible.
Yeah. Okay, let's finish up on this, Frank, and that is Mark Zuckerberg is not happy enough with Facebook. He's now talking about some pretty heavy-duty stuff like telepathy. Yeah. I mean, he really wants to be inside our heads. How concerned should we be about that?
I think we should be really concerned. I think that preserving the sanctity of our own minds is actually incredibly important. That once you that what is privacy? And I think that's actually a very basic question that most people haven't really spent a whole lot of time pondering. They abstractly say that they want to preserve privacy, but they don't really know what it is, why it exists, why they should care about it. And really, once you have somebody watching you, once you have somebody inside your head deeply, you cease to become an independent thinker. You start to bend your thoughts towards your audience. You start to become more cautious because, look, if they know your thoughts, they're going to keep them all on a computer. They're going to record them forever, and they'll be held against you at a certain point. Or at least that's the fear that I think everybody will instinctually have. And so we'll become flattened as individuals. We won't be truly thinking people at that stage.
Here's the prescription not to be flattened. World Without Mind, the existential threat of big tech. Franklin Foer. Good of you to join us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.